I am God. I watched him that night in prison as he sat on his bunk, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow with despair. The metal door of his cell was rigged so that it would close but never lock. He had planned it carefully, convinced that he was in control, even of his own death. He imagined himself running up the tier, the rope waiting the guards too far away to stop him. He thought this was his way of winning his last grasp at dignity in a life shattered by violence, guilt, and shame. I saw his tears fall onto the cold floor. I saw his chest rise and fall with that heavy, suffocating burden of hopelessness. And just as the last resolve settled in his heart, I whispered two words that shattered the silence of his soul. Try me. In an instant, despair met a voice older than time itself. His breath caught. He froze. That whisper, soft but unmistakable, cut through his pride like a sword of light through darkness. For the first time in years, he let go of his plan. He sat still, trembling, wondering if what he had heard was real. He thought he was alone, but I had been with him from the beginning. And so let me take you back not just to that prison cell, but to the days when he was still a boy, when the shadows of the streets first stretched across his path. He was born in Washington, D.C., in a neighborhood ironically named Paradise. But this place was no paradise. The projects wrapped around him like iron bars, not with steel, but with poverty, violence, and temptation. Concrete buildings stood tall like silent guards, while broken glass crunched under sneakers as children played outside with the sound of sirens echoing in the background. I watched him grow up with a father who worked hard but carried the weight of the world, and a mother who struggled with her health. Love was there, but fractured. Strains stretched across the family like cracks in a sidewalk, threatening to split wider with each passing year. At 12 years old, when most boys still clutch baseball gloves or comic books, he was handed something else: drugs. I saw his small hands fumble with baggies, saw the confusion in his young eyes as he listened to gospel music his mother loved, Kirk Franklin's voice filling the house while preparing poison to sell on the corner. He thought it was normal. He thought this was life. On the block, the crowd was always there. Hundreds of kids, men and women, spilling out of the buildings, gathering under the dim glow of streetlights. They laughed, traded money, showed off cars, clothes, and jewelry. To him, it looked like family. It felt like belonging. Inside his home, he felt small, unseen, frustrated by what he did not have. But outside with the crowd, he felt noticed, wanted, important. I remember him running out the door at the sound of his friends calling his name. That spark of joy on his face when they came looking for him, it was the kind of affirmation he thought he needed. He did not yet know that I was the one who had formed him, the one who called him by name before the world knew him. He did not know that the ache he felt in his chest was the hunger for my presence. By the time he carried his first gun, still only 12, he thought he was protecting something valuable. Pride, territory, respect, all illusions. I watched him sneak that weapon onto buses, into schools, hiding it under his jacket, with the naive belief that steel in his hand would keep him safe. He didn't see how fragile he was, but I saw. Each night I whispered to his heart. Sometimes it came as a fleeting thought. There has to be another way. He ignored it, drowned it out with music, laughter, or the rush of deals on the corner. Still I whispered, because even when he walked into darkness, I was already planning his rescue. Years passed, and the streets shaped him like clay pressed under rough hands. He became the teacher, bringing others into the trade, showing friends how to package and sell. He thought he was building a kingdom, but it was sand crumbling beneath his feet. I wept the day he pulled the trigger and took a life. I saw the man fall, saw the shock in his own eyes as he realized what he had done. The echoes of that gunshot would chase him into sleepless nights. He would laugh with his friends, but in the silence, guilt gnawed at him. Yet pride told him not to stop. And so his path led to prison. Bars and walls became his new neighborhood. The noise of hundreds of voices at once, the clang of metal, the stale air, thick with despair, this became his world. He had sought control, power, and freedom. Now he had none. Still, I was there. I was there when he sat on that bunk, replaying the crime in his mind, haunted by faces, tormented by shame. I was there when he clenched his fists and thought, if I can't control anything else, I'll control how this ends. But that night when the cell door clicked shut and the silence wrapped around him, I leaned close. I had waited for this moment for the walls to fall inside him, for his pride to crumble, and with the gentlest breath I spoke, "Try me." He stopped. He knew it was no ordinary thought. It wasn't the echo of his own mind. It wasn't the whisper of despair. It was a voice he had never truly heard before, yet it felt more familiar than his own heartbeat. My voice. He broke. Tears streamed down his face, not just of sorrow, but of recognition. For the first time he knew, really knew, that I was real, and that I wanted him, that I loved him. The rope was never tied. The plan was abandoned. In that cell, life began anew. And that was only the beginning of the story. He grew up in a place that mocked its own name. They called it paradise, but the streets were filled with sirens, broken glass, and the endless shuffle of neighbors trying to survive another day. Paradise was a maze of concrete buildings stacked so close together that voices and arguments echoed between walls late into the night. Metal gates wrapped around windows like iron masks, reminders that safety was only an illusion. I watched him as a child running barefoot across cracked sidewalks, his laughter loud and unguarded. In those moments he was still tender, still a boy, but even then the shadows were stretching toward him. I saw him watching the older boys with their shiny sneakers, cars with tinted windows and pockets full of cash. He wanted what they had. He thought that was life. Inside his home, the atmosphere was strained. His father bore the weight of providing on shoulders already bent low. A good man, determined but exhausted. His mother tried her best, though her health was fragile, her hearing failing, her strength often too weak to carry her through the day. His sisters hovered in their own struggles, trying to make sense of growing up as young women in a neighborhood that demanded toughness. And so he learned early that the world was not gentle. When he looked at his family, he saw worry lines etched across his father's face, heard the sighs of his mother, felt the tension at the dinner table, where silence spoke louder than words. In his child's mind, he mistook their struggle for neglect. He didn't see the love hidden beneath fatigue and hardship. He thought they couldn't give him what he needed, so he searched outside. That's where the street stepped in. Paradise wasn't like the suburbs where people came and went quietly in cars. It was enclosed. Everyone lived stacked together and everyone came outside. 200 people could gather on a single block, shouting, laughing, hustling, posturing. For a boy longing to belong, this crowd felt like a family. I remember the first time his friends knocked on his door, calling his name before he had even finished brushing his teeth. He rushed out, heart racing, thrilled that someone wanted him. That knock on the door felt like acceptance. Outside, the smell of fried food mixed with the sharp tang of gasoline from cars idling at the curb. Music thumped from passing stereos while deals were made in shadows just a few steps away. He was surrounded by drugs, quick money, the illusion of power, and it beckoned like a glittering trap. At 12 years old, he made his first deal. A grown man handed him a bag and some bills as casually as if it were candy. No hesitation, no thought of the boy's future, just another set of hands to move product. I watched as he pocketed the money, eyes wide, not with fear, but with fascination. That first transaction planted a seed. I can make my own way. I don't need to depend on anyone else. But it was a lie. Soon he was carrying drugs like they were treasures, hiding them in his pockets, tucking them into his sneakers. Pride swelled in him when even adults, neighbors, even parents of friends came to buy from him. Each exchange chipped away at his innocence, replacing it with a hardened shell. I watched him one evening, sitting in his room with a table cluttered with baggies. His mother's music filled the house, Kirk Franklin singing about joy and freedom, voices raised in praise. And there he sat, packaging drugs with his small hands, nodding his head to the beat. He thought it was just background noise, but I was planting seeds. Even in his rebellion, even in his confusion, my presence was near. By then he had learned to carry a gun. Too young to understand the weight of life and death, too small to hold it steady with confidence. Yet he walked with it hidden under his shirt. On the bus in the hallways of school, he carried it as though it gave him power. I looked at him and saw the child he still was trembling inside, though he would never admit it. The neighborhood praised toughness. Respect was currency, and he wanted it more than anything. Each time he stepped outside and someone nodded at him, called him little man, or asked him for a hand in business, it fueled him. He began to gather friends, recruiting them into his trade, teaching them the rhythms of the street. He thought he was building something of his own, but I knew it was a house of cards. Inside, though, he was still searching. In the quiet moments lying on his bed after a long day, he sometimes wondered, is this all there is? He would picture himself older, with more money, more cars, more fame. And then the picture would flicker, replaced by unease. But before the thought could settle, he drowned it out: more noise, more deals, more bravado. I whispered to him even then, there is another way. But the music of the streets was louder in his ears. At family dinners, he would glare at his father, silently accusing him of failing to provide. He couldn't yet see the sacrifices made, the exhaustion carried. Instead, he told himself, I'll do what he couldn't. I'll make my own path. That seed of bitterness drove him further away. And so by his teenage years, he was already known. Not as a boy with promise, but as a boy with power. He smiled when others followed him, when they looked to him as a leader. He believed he had control. But I saw deeper. I saw a boy enslaved, not free. I saw chains invisible to him, but heavy on his soul. I saw the enemy circling, whispering lies, feeding his pride. And I wept, for I knew where this road would lead. Still, I never turned away. Because even in the shadows of paradise, I was planning his redemption. The deeper he went, the more the streets claimed him. What began as small bags and trembling hands soon grew into a steady rhythm. Transactions on corners, money changing palms, faces coming and going under the streetlights. At first he was nervous. His heart would pound in his chest, his palms sweating as he handed over the goods. But pride has a way of dulling fear, and before long he wasn't nervous anymore. He was confident, too confident. I watched him sharpen his instincts, watching every face that passed, memorizing footsteps in the dark. He became a student of survival, but his teacher was fear. He carried himself with swagger, but inside he was always alert, always wondering who was watching, who might try to take what was his. The gun at his side became as familiar as his own breath. At only 12, 13, 14 years old, he was already carrying death in his waistband, like it was just another tool. The neighborhood cheered him on. Men twice his age bought from him. Mothers of friends whispered his name in the shadows, ashamed, but desperate. Friends followed him, hungry for the respect that seemed to cling to him. And so he became a teacher of sin. He pulled others into the same darkness that was consuming him, telling them how to make money, how to hide from police, how to carry themselves so no one would see fear. But I saw it. I saw his nights when the adrenaline wore off and the silence crept in. He would lie awake staring at the cracked ceiling of his bedroom, wondering if he was truly untouchable. He had money in his pockets, but he had no peace. His heart ached for something real, something lasting, though he didn't yet know it was me. Still, he pressed forward. At 15, he thought he was invincible. At 16, he thought he was building a kingdom. By 17, the shadows had grown darker. Rivalries brewed. Territory became a war zone. The same friends he laughed with could turn on him if money or power tempted them. So he held tighter to his gun, convinced that survival meant being the first to strike. I watched him as he pulled that trigger for the first time, the sound shattering the night. The echo rolled through the streets, bounced off the buildings, and buried itself in his soul. He had killed. The face of the man fell before him, and though he forced himself to stand tall, to act, hardened inside, he was shaking. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. The nights grew heavier after that. He would laugh with his friends, drink, brag, pretend he was fine. But in the silence of his cell, when no one else could see, he replayed that moment. He heard the gunshot in his dreams. He saw the eyes of the man he had taken. Guilt pressed against him like a weight on his chest. Still, pride would not let him stop. For 10 years, he lived that life. 10 years of running, hustling, fighting, teaching others to walk the same crooked path. His name was known in the projects, whispered with both respect and fear. But the very respect he sought became his prison. He couldn't let go without losing everything he thought gave him worth. His father's weary face no longer moved him. His mother's quiet prayers went unheard. The pull of the streets was too strong. Every time he stepped outside and saw the crowd, the music, the cars, the women, it reminded him of what he thought he had built. He didn't see that it was all an illusion, a stage set by the enemy to keep him bound. I whispered still, "There is another way," but he ignored it, pushing the thought aside with a laugh, a smoke, a drink. He told himself he had no choice. That was the lie the enemy fed him. This is who you are. This is all you will ever be. By his early 20s, his sins had caught up with him. One night, a decision fueled by pride and fear ended with blood on his hands again. Police lights painted the walls red and blue. Metal cuffs clamped down on his wrists. The same boy who once thought himself untouchable was dragged into the system facing charges that would strip away the illusion of freedom. The clang of prison doors echoed in his ears as reality sank in. He was no longer in control. He was no longer free. The walls pressed in, the noise of hundreds of men filled the air, and he realized he had built a life of chains. And yet even there I was near. He sat on his bunk thinking of the years behind him. He thought of the streets, of the laughter, of the pride he once carried. None of it remained. All he had left was a broken body, a guilty mind, and a future that looked like nothing but years upon years behind bars. But I was not finished with him. Because even in that cell with murder on his record and shame in his heart, I still saw the boy who used to run barefoot on cracked sidewalks longing for belonging. I still saw the child bagging drugs while Kirk Franklin sang in the background. I still saw the son I loved, the one I had created for more than this. And I knew that soon, very soon, his walls would break. Prison is a place where sound itself becomes a weight. The constant clanging of steel doors, the shouts across tiers, the echo of footsteps on concrete, it all blends into a noise that gnaws at the mind. For him, it was suffocating. 120 men packed into the same space, each with their own conversations, arguments, laughter, or curses. Even in the silence of night, there was always noise. A cough, a snore, the rattle of chains, the groan of pipes. He sat on his bunk staring at the chipped paint on the wall, asking himself the same question over and over. How did I end up here? He thought he had been building a kingdom, but now he was trapped in one of the darkest places a man can find himself. No control, no freedom, no hope, just time and too much of it. And two. The reality of a life sentence pressed down on him like a crushing stone. 20 years, maybe more. Numbers that felt endless. He thought of the streets he once ruled, the money, the cars, the faces that had once cheered his name. None of it mattered now. None of it could unlock the steel door or silence the voice in his head that whispered, "You've lost everything." He began to think of death. It wasn't sudden but gradual, like a shadow creeping across the floor. At first it was just a thought. If I die, at least I won't have to live this way. Then it became a plan. He studied the routines of the guards, the timing of their rounds, the way the doors worked. He watched carefully, waiting for an opportunity. And then he found he could rig his cell door so it would appear locked but remain unlatched. The plan was simple in his mind. Wait until everyone had gone back into their cells after breakfast. Wait until the noise died down. When the guard made his last round, slip out, run up to the top tier and hang himself. By the time anyone could get through the doors, it would be too late. He told himself this was how he would win, by choosing his own ending, by taking control one final time. He prepared everything. He sat on his bunk, the makeshift noose ready. His cellmates slept unaware of what was about to happen. He ran through the plan in his mind, picturing each step, each movement. He imagined the silence that would come after the end of the noise, the end of the shame. Tears rolled down his face as he whispered to himself, "This is it. This is how it ends." But something stirred within him, a restlessness he could not name. A voice not yet mine, but the faintest whisper of conscience urged him to wait. For the first time he questioned his decision. Is there another way? The thought was so strange, so foreign, it startled him. He had never second-guessed himself before. Every decision he'd made on the streets had been sharp, immediate, without hesitation. But here on the edge of death, something inside refused to let him move forward. He sat still, wrestling with himself. His pride screamed, "End it, take control." But his heart whispered, "Wait, just wait." And then I spoke. Not with thunder, not with fire, not with the booming of prison walls collapsing, but with a gentle, unmistakable whisper that cut through the chaos of his mind. Try me. The words struck him like lightning. He sat up straight, tears drying on his cheeks. The noise of the prison faded into the background. The plan in his head dissolved. He knew without doubt, without question, that it was my voice. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't imagination. It was the sound of hope breaking through despair. His next words came tumbling out in broken gas, desperate and raw. "You want me? You want me?" And then the dam broke. He fell to his knees on the concrete floor, his hands trembling as he cried out, "Take me, take my life. If you want it, it's yours. I'll live for you. I'll never turn back. I'll never leave you," over and over. He repeated it, the declaration spilling out of him until his throat was hoarse. The noose lay forgotten at his side. The cell that had been prepared for death became a sanctuary of life. My spirit filled that space, flooding his heart with love and freedom, unlike anything he had ever known. In one moment, the murderer, the drug dealer, the broken man plotting his own death was reborn. When the morning call came for showers, he rushed to the phone and dialed his mother. His voice was breathless, trembling with joy. "Ma, I just heard God. He spoke to me in my cell. He told me to try him. I gave him my life." She wept, praising me on the other end of the line. That day marked the death of his old self and the birth of something new. The prison walls remained, the sentence still loomed. But within those steel bars, freedom had already begun. The cell was the same. The walls hadn't shifted, the iron bars hadn't melted away, and the noise of prison life hadn't grown quieter. Yet inside of him, everything had changed. The weight that had pressed him into despair, the thought that his life was over, lifted in that moment. I whispered, "Try me." He woke the next morning with a new kind of fire. His eyes opened not to the endless sameness of prison, but to a life that felt suddenly possible. He rose from his bunk with a strange calm, carrying the memory of my voice in his chest like a treasure he could not lose. But joy does not erase the past. Even as he prayed, even as he whispered, "I'm yours, Lord, I'm yours," his mind carried him back to the streets, back to the men he had trained to sell poison, back to the mothers who bought from him, back to the face of the man he had killed. The guilt rose up like a storm threatening to drown the flame I had ignited. He sat with his head in his hands, whispering through gritted teeth, "How can you want me after everything I've done? How can you love me? How can you forgive me?" The prison routine pressed on. He ate, he walked the yard. He listened to the clamor of voices, but all the while shame gnawed at him. When he bowed his head to pray, the enemy whispered, "God may have saved you, but he hasn't forgotten what you did. You'll pay for this forever." At night he tossed and turned, pain searing through his body without explanation. His bones ached, his joints throbbed, and no doctor could find the cause. He wept into his pillow, thinking it was my punishment, believing I had saved him only to make him suffer as repayment. Still, even in pain, he clung to me. He woke before dawn, dragging himself out of bed to pray. He opened the worn Bible that someone had slipped into his hands. He read with tears, blurring the words, "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come." He whispered those words into the silence, trying to believe them, even as guilt tightened its grip. Others began to notice the change. Fellow inmates saw the way he carried himself differently. Guards hardened by years of watching men break paused when they heard his voice rising in prayer. A pastor serving time in the same prison leaned against the bars one day and whispered, "I see something in you, brother. Don't let go of it." He tried not to. But the condemnation came like waves. He would lead a Bible study in the common room, his voice filled with fire, only to return to his cell and collapse in silence, his mind screaming, "Murderer, criminal, fraud." I watched him struggle, and though my voice grew quiet in those days, I was nearer than he knew. Silence does not mean absence. I was teaching him that faith is not built on constant signs and wonders, but on trust when the heavens seem still. And slowly he began to understand. One morning he stood in front of the cracked mirror above the sink. He stared at his reflection, seeing both the man he had been and the man he was becoming. He pressed his hand to the glass and whispered, "You're forgiven." He said, "I'm new. I'm new." The words shook him because, For the first time, he began to believe them. And I confirmed it in subtle ways. A fellow inmate approached him and said, "Man, I was going to take my life last night. But then I heard you talking about Jesus. You gave me hope." Tears filled his eyes. He realized that even in chains, I was using him. That his story, the very past he despised, was becoming a bridge for others to cross into light. Day after day, he led men in prayer. He taught them to sing hymns in a place where laughter was rare. He opened scripture in the cafeteria, turning a metal table into a pulpit. My fire spread through that prison tier until even the guards would linger listening in secret. Yet still at night he wrestled. He would pace his cell whispering, "Lord, I know you saved me, but why me? Why not someone better? Why not someone clean?" And I answered not with thunder, but with a memory the very moment in his cell when he heard my whisper, "Try me." That was enough. He sank to his knees, hands lifted, tears streaming down his face. "Then I'll try you again tomorrow and the next day and the next. I'll keep trying you, Lord, until I have nothing left to give." The battle wasn't over. The guilt wasn't gone, but grace had taken root, and grace once planted cannot be uprooted. His body still ached. His sentence still loomed, but I was shaping him. Every moment of shame became an opportunity for him to choose faith. Every whisper of condemnation became a chance to declare, "I am new." And as he learned to believe it, his chains, though still locked around his wrists, began to break in his soul. 6 years passed. 6 years of waking up to the clang of metal doors, of shuffling in line for meals, of carrying the ache of shame and the hope of salvation side by side. 6 years of learning to believe that I was with him, even when the pain in his body screamed louder than his prayers. Then came the day he had both longed for and dreaded: court reconsideration. He stood in the bullpen, a cramped room where prisoners waited like cattle. The smell of sweat, steel, and despair hung heavy. Around him, men muttered curses, some laughed too loud, others stared at the floor. But his heart pounded with a different weight. "Lord, whatever happens, I'll trust you," he whispered. His lawyer walked in, shuffling papers. "Look," the man said, lowering his voice, "we've got a chance. How much time do you want me to ask for?" The question pierced him. He knew the unspoken rules: judges didn't cut sentences in half, not for murderers, not for violent men. Asking for too much would sound arrogant. Most men asked for 3 years off, maybe 5 if they were bold. He hesitated. Fear wrapped around him like chains. If he spoke the wrong words, if he aimed too high, would the judge laugh in his face? Would they slap him with more time instead? But in that moment, I reminded him of the ram in the thicket, the substitute I had provided for Abraham on the mountain. Just as Abraham had lifted the knife, just as he had prepared to surrender what he loved most, I had whispered, "Stop. I will provide." And so I whispered again, "Trust me." His lawyer studied his face. "I think we should ask for 10 years, he said carefully. "What do you think?" 10 years. The number rang in his spirit like a bell. Without hesitation, he nodded. "Yes, that's it. Ask for 10. Moments later, he stood before the judge. The man who had once sentenced him leaned back in his chair, studying him. "I remember you," the judge said slowly. "When I gave you 20 years, I asked if you had anything to say. Do you know how many men curse me or faint or scream when I hand down that kind of time? But you said something I never forgot. I don't even remember the words, but I remember the way you said them. It stuck with me." The room grew still. His lawyer cleared his throat and asked for 10 years. The judge smiled faintly. "You got it." Just like that. No debate, no delay. The gavel struck and the sentence was cut in half. But that wasn't the end of the miracle. Back at the prison intake, an officer carrying his paperwork frowned. She flipped through the pages, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "You've got a murder charge. You should have 20 years. His stomach tightened. Was it a mistake? Was the blessing about to be snatched away? But she folded the paper and slid it through the bars, showing him only the corner. It read in bold letters, 10 years. She narrowed her eyes. "Must be a typo," she said. "But it's in the system now, so there's nothing I can do about it." He walked away, the paper in his hands, his heart trembling with awe. Still the enemy whispered, "It's a mistake. They'll fix it. Don't get your hopes up." For months he lived with that fear every time his name was called for mail or meetings. This is it, he thought. They found the error. They're taking it back. But when the reconsideration letter finally came, it didn't revoke the miracle. It confirmed it. The prosecutor, the very one who had once called him a menace, who had demanded the maximum sentence, had written a letter to the judge, a letter recommending mercy, a letter saying, "I believe in the change I see in this man." Who could explain such a thing? Who could move the heart of a prosecutor to plead for the freedom of the very man he had once condemned? Only me. And so with 6 years already served and good behavior credited, he walked free in just 8 months more. The day the gates opened, he stepped into the sunlight breathing air that tasted like heaven itself. The chains were gone both around his wrists and in his soul. He lifted his face to the sky and whispered, "Lord, you did it. You really did it." I had taken him from the streets at 12, through blood and sin and despair, through the very edge of death in a prison cell, and I had written a new ending. A miracle not of loopholes or chance, but of divine grace. He thought he had been forgotten, but I had been writing his story all along. And this was only the beginning. The gates clanged shut behind him, and for the first time in years he stood under the wide open sky, without bars cutting across the horizon. The air was different out here. It tasted freer, richer, like it carried the weight of promise. He lifted his hands, his eyes brimming with tears, whispering over and over, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you." But freedom came with its own trials. Out here, the fire that had burned so brightly in prison met the winds of daily life. Jobs turned him away. Applications stamped with rejection because of one-word felon. He fasted, he prayed, he begged me for opportunities, only to watch them slip through his fingers. One day, after finally being hired at a store, he was fired within days when the background check cleared. He stood outside in the rain, the paper in his hand, shaking his head. "Lord, I prayed. I trusted. Why would you let this happen?" Yet even in that moment, I whispered again, "Try me." So he walked on, determined to trust. He worked wherever doors opened, even if it meant walking an hour in the snowshoes, soaked and broken passersby staring. He pressed on, remembering the vow he made in that cell, "I will never leave you, Lord, no matter what." And I honored his persistence. He found steady work. He married. He held his child in his arms again, no longer as the broken man who had once planned to end his life, but as a father redeemed. The fire inside him was no longer just for survival, it was a calling. He began to tell his story, in small Bible studies in churches and street corners, where others wandered the same path he once walked. Men who thought they were too far gone listened with wide eyes as he told them about my voice in a prison cell. Women wept as he described the night he had planned to hang himself, only to be interrupted by grace. And every time he stood to speak, I stood with him. The same presence that filled that prison tier filled the rooms where he testified, and people felt it deep in their bones. They felt that what he said was true. Still, the enemy tried to whisper. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he would sit alone and think of the man he had killed. He would remember the weight of the gun, the sound that never left his ears. He would whisper, "Why me, Lord? Why save me? Why bless me when I don't deserve it?" And I would answer him as I answer all who ask, because my grace is not about deserving, it is about choosing, and I chose you. That truth steadied him. Slowly, the guilt that once crushed him became the platform for his testimony. What once chained him became the very proof of my power to set free. He learned to see himself not as a murderer defined by the past, but as a child of God defined by my love. And as he embraced that truth, others began to see it too. The man once feared in his neighborhood became a man people looked to for hope. The one who taught boys to sell poison now taught them to seek life. His story spread further than he ever imagined, beyond prison walls, beyond his city, into homes and hearts of people who had never seen a cell but still lived in chains of their own. Because this was never just his story, it was mine. I am the God who whispers into the darkest nights, who steps into the filthiest cells, who speaks to murderers, addicts, and outcasts. I am the God who says, "Try me." And to every soul listening now, I say the same to you. No matter what you've done, no matter how deep the pit, how dark the night, how heavy the guilt, try me. I am the light that no prison can contain, the mercy that no sin can outmatch, the love that no shame can erase. He thought his story was finished when he planned his death. But I had only just begun. And if you think your story is over, listen to me. It's not. The journey from darkness to light begins with one step. One, whisper one choice to believe, Lord, I will try you. And if you have heard this story today, don't let it pass you by. Let it stir something in your heart. Share it with someone who needs hope. Reflect on the grace that is reaching for you right now. And if you want more stories of my power, my mercy, my miracles, listen, and walk with me. Because the light that saved him is the same light that can save you. This is my story. This is his story, and maybe it can be yours too.